Hello, it's Jennifer from Sea Lemon. A lot of people ask me what books I recommend about bookbinding, and I find it difficult to answer that because there are so many books that I haven't looked at or compared. So instead, I thought I'd share with you the collection of books that I already have. These are books that I have collected over the years that have inspired me and got me through my bookbinding journey. They may not be for everyone, but maybe you'll find this helpful and interesting. I want to put a big reminder here that if you're looking for a book about any topic, check your local library first. I think libraries are really underestimated. I was surprised to find newer titles at mine, and if it's not something you were looking for, then you just checked out the book and you didn't lose any money. Okay, so I think this is the first book I've ever bought about bookbinding. It's Bookbinding Techniques and Projects by Josep Cambras. I honestly don't know if this is still available or if maybe there's a newer edition out. History, evolution, tools and materials, processes and techniques, paper painting techniques, step-by-step projects. Really big type, kind of like a school book. Brief history, and I also like that it had big images, very easy to look at. It goes through tools and materials, but obviously as a beginner, you're most likely not going to have this really nice book press. It gives you a general idea of what type of equipment is used for bookbinding. Some of this stuff I still don't have. You don't always have to have every single tool to make your book projects. Sewing sheets and signatures, like the very basics of things. It doesn't have like Coptic stitch or anything really technical. Gluing basics. It does talk about rubber cement, which I am not a fan of, but it does give you, again, like a brief overview of things. Especially if you're not familiar with this kind of stuff, it doesn't overwhelm you, which is what I like. I do have a tutorial that shows how to make an envelope in the back of your book, and I might have referenced this when making it. It does have some box making projects. Next book I have is I Love Handmade Books by Charlotte Rivers, Timeless Techniques and Fresh Ideas for Beautiful Handmade Books. I was contacted by Charlotte Rivers to be in this book along with many other book artists, and at the time when I gave my information for my spread, I didn't even know who was going to be in this book. So when I bought this book, it was really exciting to see all the other book artists that I wasn't even aware of. This book does have some tutorials, but I mostly use it for inspiration, and that's, I think, what it's better suited for. If you're like a beginner and you just want an idea of what can be done with bookbinding and book art, and maybe you need some inspiration, I think this is a great book for that. Folded bindings, sewn bindings, page and cover treatments, experimental packaging, and bookmaking in practice. And in the very back, it does have a glossary of bookbinding terms, but also an index of every single shop name that is included in this. So if you ever want to look these people up, follow them on Instagram or follow their shops, it's a good resource. I follow her. Ruth Bleakley is a good person to follow for bookbinding. Most of the book artists have a spread, or 1 page to 2 pages, and then some included a tutorial. They're more of an illustrated style versus pictures. So I am page 75 and 160. Page 75 is just my brief overview. I do remember that it was kind of complicated to explain giving the author this information through email. I don't even know if this really makes sense without seeing any of the videos I've made. I think they looked at my tutorial from YouTube and illustrated it from there. The illustrator was trying to do the book press I made, which kind of looks funny. I really don't know how easy this is to understand, honestly, so if you get this book, I wouldn't get it for the case binding tutorial. This book may be not the best for step-by-step tutorials, but it is great for inspiration. It's a cute little book to keep on hand and display also. After getting that book, I was really interested in continuing my knowledge of different binding techniques, and that's when I started to collect and invest in the Keith Smith books. And the first one I got was the Non-Adhesive Binding Books Without Paste or Glue. At the time, I remember getting more frustrated with projects that involved glue, and I wanted to explore more exposed thread type of sewing book projects. Preparation of the binding, descriptions of bindings, sewing pamphlets, stab bindings. This is where I learned the buttonhole stitch binding. It's kind of impossible for me alone to learn every single one of these bindings in all of these Keith Smith books, because it's a little too much for me, for my brain. For sure, these books are so comprehensive in different binding techniques, but they do take a lot of attention, I would say. And it will tell you exactly the correct way of doing things. And I don't always follow the correct ways. And most of the bindings have a picture to learn from, which was really helpful. It's not something you could just look at right away and understand. I have to go back, read, and go back again and again. I bookmark a lot of these pages for maybe someday I will try. And the further you get into these books, the more intricate the sewings can get. This book also has piano hinge binding and Coptic stitch binding. Some pages do show examples, and as you can see, the whole book is black and white. The next one is 1, 2, and 3 section sewings. So again, exploring more no glue methods, more exposed bindings. All of these books, by the way, have like a binding on the spine. There's a lot of different patterns in here. If you're interested in exposed sewing patterns on the bindings, this is a really fun book to look at. And some of them have different variations on how to do the same thing. And much like the other one, the further you go into the book, the more complex the techniques get. And like I said, I haven't done a lot of these because there's just so many. Personally, for me, I do get a little overwhelmed when I look at these books because they're so technical. Look at some of these patterns. They are so complex, but they're really cool. So if you're into different stitches on the spine of exposed bindings, definitely recommend this book. The next one after that, I got the Non-Adhesive Binding Volume 3, Exposed Spine Sewings. I think I've only done one project from this book. So this one goes into more Coptic sewings. There's a Celtic weave, a Greek sewing, and it does show you how to make sewing frames for binding books in that way. I've never tried that, but it does have an in-depth tutorial. Just looking at this kind of overwhelms me. But it is, again, really cool to have a place where you can go if you do want to try stuff like this. Like, look at all these patterns. So if you're into exposed sewings and bindings, I think this would be a more advanced step. I'm not sure I would go to this if I were a beginner. Then I continued on to the Non-Adhesive Binding Volume 4, which is the Smith's Sewing Single Sheets. This one has multiple ways on how to do single sheets. So I've uploaded one tutorial, but there are many different ways and different sewing techniques for it. Some of the photos are a little pixelated. So one sheet is sewing raised cords if you want to add cords to the covers. And there's a whole back section of variations and inspiration. It does have an overview of the different books you can find from Keith Smith. I really recommend Keith Smith books. There's just nothing like them out there. And they're so comprehensive, very detailed, can possibly get overwhelmed if you're a beginner. But if you are wanting to get more advanced into bookbinding, highly recommend these books. I haven't gotten to the level of these ones yet, but these ones right now are my favorite. A recent book I've added to my collection is The Archaeology of Medieval Bookbinding by J.A. Szirmai. Not saying that right. I first saw this on a YouTube channel called DOS Bookbinding. If you're really into bookbinding, highly recommend that channel. I'll link it down below. I don't know if this is something a beginner should get, but if bookbinding interests you, especially old bindings and medieval beginnings of bookbinding, you might find this really interesting. I'm really into exposed bindings and bindings that don't use glue. I was curious to see how they handled exposed bindings. I'm just more looking at the forms they used and how the binding techniques lasted through time. I'll be honest, I have not read this whole book. I think I've just started it in pieces and then kind of forgot that I had it, and then now going back to it. If you're into archaeology and you're into old books and maybe some history, you might find this book interesting. but just know it is very text heavy. You can find links to all of these books in the description below, and if you have any suggestions for books about bookbinding, leave it in the comments below. Thumbs up if you like videos like this, and thank you to my members and patrons for supporting this channel. If you're interested in joining, I'll link that down below, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!